welcome to the Bamboo Podcast, where we interview a range of guests on self-care, baby care, and relationships during the perinatal period. We're your hosts, Kayla
and Leah.
Today's guest is Jessie Borelli.
Dr. Jessica Borelli received her PhD from Yale University and is now a professor of psychological science at the University of California, Irvine, as well as a clinical psychologist specializing in children and families. Jessie is also the author of a parenting book about strategies for raising resilient kids and a mum of 3.
Jessie shares her really personal health journey, which takes a lot of courage to be so vulnerable, and we really enjoyed this chat with her.
I love this topic of guilt, especially around mother's guilt, and how it is a process of redefining who I am as a mother.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out the episode linked below where we chat with Jessie about relational savoring, which is the practice of prolonging the feeling of connectedness we have with others. Enjoy.
Jessie, you have done work on guilt and empathy. I feel that no one tells you about mother's guilt when you're pregnant. You kind of have the baby and it instantly happens. And I'm sure I've scared Kayla to death about parenthood, and just basically how guilt impacts you as a mother. For me, there's been times of immense guilt when you're deciding between work, childcare, how much homework your child's doing. Yeah, and just the time that you can spend with each child when you have multiple children, or the time that you spend at work. Like, it's just quite consuming as a mother, but also as a clinician and talking to mums. I would say that it nearly comes up in every conversation, particularly if they have other children. And I was just wondering, I would just love to know, as an expert and as a mother who is really successful and has a long-standing career, how do you balance your work responsibilities with your childcare responsibilities?
Yeah, I mean, my gut answer to that question is poorly. But to be honest, like, I feel like it's an ongoing struggle, and I think I don't know anybody who's a mom and an academic or a professional who doesn't struggle with that, and I think that tells you something about how challenging it is to balance these things. It's really hard. It's really hard to have children and have a career and balance them. And that may not be the answer that you want. I can tell you how I do it, but I think it's really hard.
Yeah, it is. It's really, but it's normalizing it, isn't it? And having these type of conversations so that people know and people at home can hear we're all struggling with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that for me, balance has been a process of defining and redefining what it means to be a mother and what it means to be an academic, kind of at every stage of my kids' development. And that has been a very emotional journey. So, meaning it hasn't been easy. It's been hard and fraught with a lot of guilt, as we were talking about, and also a lot of anxiety. But I think that, like, for instance, my kids are now 14, 11, and 9. So old, on the older end of things. But like when they were really little, I spent a lot more time at home. I had a nanny, and I would breastfeed them. Like, I would have them either come to work to see me, or I would go home to see them for every feeding. And like, those were the kinds of trade-offs that I would make so that I wouldn't miss things like that. But now it means like cutting off my work day at a certain time so I can go to their sporting activity, just to give concrete examples of where lines are for me. But I think that it has meant kind of like defining where are my boundaries in each of these spheres of my life, and my professional life and my parenting life, and how do I feel about those things, and recognizing that I cannot do everything that goes into each category. I can't. And I need to accept that, and I need to kind of embrace the feelings that I have about that.
I really love that you said that, because it infuriates me when people say you can do it all as a mother and a career woman, because it's somewhere, you're going to have to make some sacrifices. And I don't think that is the way that it should be presented to young women. I think it should be really clear that you will have to set those boundaries in place. And you can't give 100% to all of those facets of your life.
You can't. And I think you can probably decide what those boundaries are. Like, for instance, I've decided I'm not going to do, I don't know if you guys have like a PTA or room mom types of things. Does that, are those terminology?
Yeah, in schools, you mean, like
In schools, yeah.
yeah, the parent-led
Right.
boarding
Like
schools, yeah.
parent involvement. I've decided like I'm not going to do those types of things. But I am going to take my kids to doctor's appointments, for instance, as opposed to having, you know, a babysitter take my kids to doctor's appointments or my husband do all that, right? And activities, stuff like that. But I can't do the extra types of things. I'm also not gonna make home baked goods for school functions. You know, I kind of like have my own boundaries about this is what I am going to do and this is what I'm not going to do, and I'm going to work on the feelings that I have about not doing those other things, because I still have feelings about that, because I grew up with a mom who didn't work, so she did all of those things also. That contributes to it too.
That's interesting you say that. Yeah, that then you're kind of looking back to how you were brought up.
Mhm.
And in a sense, with mum being at home, we have that idealization that they're doing it all, they're making the baked goods and things, and just having to sit really comfortably with, I can't do the baked goods, but I will have the goods ready to take, but they'll just not be homemade goods. And really being able to sit with those feelings of what you are comfortable, because we cannot do it all. It is impossible. And having that standard of having to pretend that we can do it all is really exhausting for everyone. Yeah, I love that you really just, so basically we're saying to people out there, pick the things that you feel comfortable that you can do, and if, because you can't do it all, and set those boundaries up for yourself and work out what's most important for you on that list of all the jobs that you need to do.
And I think it can be really grounding to say, like, what are your top parenting values? You know, what are the things that are most important to you as a parent? You know, is it being present, being emotionally available? I'm just coming up with some, but I think parents have to pick what theirs are. Is it being emotionally available? Is it being trustworthy? Is it being reliable? Is it being, you know, having a religious framework for your kids? Is it, you know, I don't know. You could come up with whatever those are, but then I think when you come up with what those are, I think you want to stand behind those and translate those into action. And I think every parent is going to have a different version of their most salient kind of values are that would translate into a different like action plan for them. And I think one of the tricks is trying to make sure that's in alignment with how you're living your life as a parent.
And Jessie, what are some of the potential impacts when mums feel that those values aren't in alignment or the guilt feels really overwhelming?
Yeah, so a long time ago, I was interested in this topic, largely because of my own experience. And I was talking to other moms thinking about this experience of guilt, and not, you know, not just guilt in general, but really this kind of specific guilt that Leah was talking about, where you have guilt about not being there for your child, specifically about your work impacting you to the point where you can't be there for your child. And I looked in the research literature and saw that really very few people had studied this, and nobody had looked at gender differences in this. So I decided to do a few studies looking at gender differences, and surprise, surprise, we found that women have this to a greater extent than men did. And we also found that when women have more of this type of guilt, they're also at risk for other types of things, like they become more permissive in their parenting. And by that, I mean that, you know, they're more likely to give in to their child when their child's making unreasonable demands, which also makes sense if you think about it, because I think parents who are feeling like they need to compensate for something, like they're deficient in some ways, they feel like they owe their child something. Like, you know, I'm not living up to my kind of part of this contract that I've made with you. I should be doing more here. So I'm going to kind of give in this other way. But we know that this kind of permissive parenting is also not good for children. So that's a negative outcome for kids too. And so it leads to some interesting ideas in terms of if we can help parents with their guilt, then that might also improve their parenting.
And then help the child in the long run.
And help the child, right.
Yeah. What advice would you give to mothers experiencing guilt? How can they try and change this guilt process that we go through?
I think that, you know, as I've said kind of before, that I think, you know, moms in particular, because it's moms who have more of this than dads, I think moms need to have a more realistic sense of what can be accomplished and what can't be accomplished. And I don't want to put all of the burden on moms, because I really think that a lot of this comes from the broader society. We haven't published this data, but I can tell you from our data, one thing that we find is that moms who have more of this guilt are more likely to have moms who didn't work themselves, which is kind of echoing what I was telling you before about my own experience. So I think a lot of it is role modeling and what moms feel like are the expectations that are placed on them, or that they feel are placed on them by at least their familial environment, and maybe by the broader culture, for who they need to be if they're also moms who, these are all moms who are working that we were studying. So moms who work more hours then feel more of this. But I think actually moms who work more hours should get more of an out, because they're working more hours, they're carrying more of a load for the family. If we were to think about this from the other side of things, like if we're thinking about fathers who work more hours, I think we would think like, oh, wow, they're doing so much for their family. Because our gender stereotype says like that's consistent with the male gender stereotype, that we would think like, oh, dads are doing so much for their family if they're working so hard. But when we think about it in the context of women, I think that violates what we expect of women, right? So I guess just being more charitable in terms of what individual women can do, I think they can try to do somewhat of an internal reframe, and think about, what they're giving their children through working, because I think working has tangible benefits for children. In fact, there's lots of research that shows that. And then also trying to just be gentler with themselves in terms of the way that they talk to themselves. And then I think we need broader societal change too.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's lovely to hear. Thank you.
Yeah.
Jessie, I wanted to talk to you about an article I read in which you discussed preparing for your double mastectomy. And I felt quite emotional reading about how you were breastfeeding at the time and holding your daughter and sitting with that knowledge that there would be impacts on your children during that recovery process. So perhaps you could share from that experience the guilt that mothers can experience when things don't go as planned. So perhaps thinking about mums who felt strongly about breastfeeding, but it just isn't working out for them. Or perhaps there is that serious illness which you experienced in your family. How can mums approach these unexpected circumstances?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think as moms, as parents, we feel a lot of responsibility to protect our children from the ills of the world, right? And to make this world a really safe place for our children. And then things happen in life where we realize we can't protect our children from those things. So we can't protect them from everything, right? Like life happens and we can't protect them. And so you saw that article, which was a really difficult time in my life. It was about like now maybe 9 years ago, or like 8.5 years ago, that I wrote that article. And the purpose of that surgery was to prevent me from getting breast cancer, because I have the BRCA mutation, which confers a very high risk for breast and ovarian cancer. In that surgery, I had my breast removed, and I also had my ovaries removed. And I ended up having to have 7 more surgeries after that. And then 7 years later, I got breast cancer, which was a huge surprise to everybody, because you're not supposed to get breast cancer after you have that surgery. And it was especially a huge surprise to my children, because the whole reason that I had had all these surgeries was to avoid getting cancer. And part of the way that I had talked to my children about this whole thing was that I was doing all of this to avoid getting cancer. And I had even said to them, like, cancer is this really horrible disease that I really don't want to get. So I'm going through all this awful stuff now so I won't get cancer. But then when I got cancer, then they were really scared of it. And the breast cancer that I had was, early stage, and I have since managed it. Like I ended up having to have 4 more surgeries and a year of chemo, but now I'm done, or mostly done. But they went through a lot. And so, yeah, I feel like to get a very long-winded way to get back to your question, I think that, again, I think this is another area where maybe it's important to recontextualize how we see ourselves as parents that our job is not to protect children from everything, right? Our job is to hold their hand as we walk through these difficult experiences and to let them know that we're there by their sides and we're there to like hug them through things and help them understand, make sense of and understand these experiences. But we can't protect our children from everything. You know, they're going to lose people to death in their lives. They're going to, experience really painful things. And we're going to be there by their sides as much as we can, but we can't take everything away.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yeah.
Beautiful. But it is just, protecting them and holding their hand through everything that life's going to throw at them. I love it. Thank you.
And thinking about those challenging emotions that children might experience during those difficult times, such as when a parent is sick, as in your case, also relates to your work on parental empathy. What is parental empathy and how can parents be more in tune with their children's emotions?
Yeah, so I've been really interested in parents' ability to understand their children's emotions and also to feel alongside their children. So I've done work on reflective functioning. Is that a concept that you know something about?
But maybe you could explain it
Yeah.
a little bit.
No, okay. Yeah, so reflective function, and I see reflective functioning and empathy as being very connected. So, reflective functioning is kind of the parent's ability to understand that thoughts and feelings like are motivators of behavior within the child. And then, so I can give you an example of that in a second. And then empathy is the parent's ability to really feel with or feel alongside the child. So if you think about a child's behavior, like I'll give you an example from maybe one of my kids, like my son earlier today kind of came home from school and came in my room and I was working here and storms in and is kind of huffing and puffing and like red and then grabs a piece of paper and writes me a note in the middle of the meeting. But let's just say before I saw what his note said. So I could, from a reflective functioning perspective, I can try to be, wondering about and curious about what's going on in his mind. Like rather than looking at his behavior and being like, oh my gosh, he's so demanding, right? Comes in the room where I'm working and he's loud and he's got a red face and he's doing all these things, right? I could be instead, that would be kind of a non-reflective way of thinking about it. I could be thinking about like, oh gosh, I wonder what happened, what's going on in his mind that might make him be acting this way. Like maybe he's really frustrated or he had a hard day at school and he's stressed out and he wants to connect with me, for example. And then from an empathy point of view, I could be, really like concerned about him and feeling alongside with him. And maybe if I understand that he's distressed, really feeling concern for that distress and feeling with him, right? And I've been really interested in this idea that parents, when they feel more empathy for their children, that predicts positive outcomes in children, like things like children being more securely attached and being able to react better to stressors and things like that. And so we've done a number of studies where we looked at parents' empathy for children and how it predicts outcomes in children. And we found things that have supported our hypotheses in that way.
Yeah, great. I think it's really interesting touching on those sort of situational factors. And I think it's really tricky as well if we're dealing with, difficult situations or busy day at work to then think about the impact that might be having, perhaps on your child.
Yeah, so parenting doesn't happen in a vacuum, right?
Nothing.
If we would all be the best parents if we didn't have anything else to focus on except our children, but we're parenting while we're working, we're taking care of our house, we're multitasking, we have multiple children often, right? So we've got a lot of different things to attend to, and it gets really, really tricky when you're trying to balance all these different things and be sensitive and responsive to each and every single, child that you have. It's tricky.
It would then also be crucial to reflect on how we were parented. So I think it was common for a lot of children growing up in South Africa when I did to have more authoritarian parents who just expected that obedience regardless of, whatever situation they were in and generally just responded to behaviors. So making that decision to inquire about your child's inner processes could then perhaps be even more challenging to do.
That requires a lot of inner strength to do that. Yeah.
And Jessie, how does reflective functioning and parental empathy impact children? Perhaps thinking about those long-term outcomes.
So, I mean, a lot of research, not just my own, but my own and other people's research shows that when kids are parented with empathy, they grow up understanding their own emotions better and to have better emotion regulation, and then to develop better social skills as well, and have like lower risk for kind of behavioral problems and things like that. So all around good things.
That's lovely to hear. And really, going back to, if you can have empathy with your child and helping them regulate their own emotions, I think is a really hot topic at the moment on how parents can support and, like you said before, stand next to them when they're having those really big emotions and have that empathy around what's actually going on for them. It's really interesting.
And one kind of important thing about empathy too that can be a little bit tricky is that the emotional response of the parent has to be really focused on the child and not kind of emotional contagion. So it can be easy for the parent to sometimes become concerned about the child, but then have the concern become focused on the parent. So if you're, worried about your child's emotional response or concerned about it, and then it becomes your own worry, right? And you become, if you imagine a child who's studying for a test, for instance, and you're like, oh, I feel so bad that they're so anxious. But then you get anxious and you get your own worry, right? And it becomes your own kind of little thing that's over here, separate from the child. That's no good. So it has to, in order to really be empathy, it has to really be focused on the child's emotion and not about your own emotional experience. That's kind of an important distinction.
Yeah. And would you say that when you do that, if you kind of then make it a little bit more about you, it kind of takes away from what that child's experiencing?
Yeah.
And they feel that?
Yeah. Yeah, because then I think they have to focus on taking care of the parent. They direct their attention to the parent rather than focusing on the self, which is supposed to be kind of what was happening there.
Yeah. I was going to ask, what are some tips for parents to have empathy, particularly on those challenging days?
My number one tip is to slow down. Slow down and try to just notice and tune in to what your child is doing behaviorally, and then try to use that as a cue to what you think might be happening within your child's mind. Like, what do you think your child's thinking or feeling? And then, you can always ask your child if they're verbal. You can ask them what they're thinking or feeling. If they're not verbal, you can continue to look at their behavior for clues about what you think they might be thinking or feeling. And then to try to respond to what you think might be happening within them. But I really think the first most important step is the slowing down, because I think that we miss so many things by reacting so quickly and making assumptions about what's happening within our child.
That's it, and asking that question, well, what's going on right now? Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to do this with us. It's been really exciting.